I admit to no small amount of fury when Merida managed to force us away from her collection of dwarves in Hydron Taig. Her powers were already great enough to threaten thousands at that point, or so I believed. So did the architect. When we left the Taig, I could see the dwarves they'd left to hold the area and prepared to attack them. A rumble in the stone beneath my feet made me reconsider. Even from that distance, Merida could threaten us. So, we left. Over the following months and years, I prodded and gauged how close we could get, but her sphere of influence grew exponentially. No scout I sent ever returned. Even when her abilities weren't in an area the Legion of the Dead was. The Legion was better equipped now. It seemed the Legion's full force was constantly patrolling the dwarf's territory outside of Merida's ability to keep it safe. This concentrated their numbers and allowed them to grow more familiar with the tunnels and deep roads, and it allowed them to respond faster whenever they encountered my scouts. We were constantly being pushed back. My inability to strike at my enemy infuriated me. The architect recommended patience and growing our forces, a prospect that was less and less possible by the day. The few woken generals we had recommended going to Ostagar to attack the elves. If we could surprise them, we could easily overwhelm them. But I knew that if we went after Merida's allies, we would send her on the warpath. She would start hunting us down without mercy. That was not acceptable. I pulled our forces back and thought about what else I could do. It took me some time before I begrudgingly asked myself what Merida would do. I realized that she was using her knowledge of the world to her advantage. She was using it to become more and more powerful, more influential. I had to do the same. The problem, however, was that I was as influential as I could get. There were no allies the Darkspawn could turn to, so I settled on gaining power. The sleeping old gods were a possibility, but I had bluffed when I told Merida I knew where to find the Grey Wardens. I understood where they were, but there was no way for me to reliably find them. The Darkspawn cannot safely travel on the surface, and there are no maps of the deep roads. Mining would take too long, and without any kind of reliable way to find out where we were, hunting the Warden's headquarters was nearly impossible. I went over dozens of options over a series of years. All the while, my Darkspawn would raid small hamlets and towns. These raids were rarely worth it, though. Merida's influence hounded our steps in the form of her damned surface dwarves. Wherever we raided, dwarves were there. Dwarves were always prepared to fight our kind, and we lost more of our numbers than we gained with any successful raid. My frustration grew to the point that I was close to madness. It wasn't until I remembered that I could find a way to gain more power. The risks of this were considerable, but I couldn't pass the opportunity up. I stood from my fire and marched down several hallways to where the architect ran his experiments. The twisted-looking creature paused in the middle of inspecting a tome we had managed to get from a raid. 7. What brings you to my laboratory? I scowled. I had named myself 7 just so Merida could have something to call me, and the architect had taken to calling me that. I hated it. I snorted as I approached. I have come up with a plan to gain more power. Power enough that I should be able to contend with the princess. The architect canted his head to the side. I'm intrigued. What have you thought of? Do you know how an archdemon spirit can take over the body of any Darkspawn if it's killed by anything other than a Grey Warden? I asked as I picked over the curiosities. I am aware of the effect, the architect confirmed. Why do you think it can do this? I asked. Do you think it can do this because it overwhelms the Darkspawn and smothers its soul, as if it was imposing its will upon the Darkspawn, then using its power to warp its new host into the Archdemon's original form? One would assume it is something akin to what you have proposed, the architect mused. Why do you ask? I ignored its question and continued. If it is a matter of willpower, of two spirits vying for power until one gains control, do you think there is a way to tip the scales in the weaker spirit's favor? The architect hummed in thought, then moved to a large bookcase. It ran one of its elongated talons along the spines of the many tomes before pulling one out and flipped it open. There are several spells that can bolster one's spirit, but there are also items which can enhance the effect many times over. The cost for such items is high, but I do not believe they will bother you. They require both blood and sacrifice. If more than one was used, will their effects bolster each other? I prodded. It is possible, it mused in thought. I'm unsure. I don't believe such an experiment has been done before. If I'm right, we won't have a chance to experiment, I said, watching as it looked through the pages. How long will one item take to make? I'm uncertain, it admitted. I have not created something like this before. A month, possibly more. How big will they be? I pressed. The size of an item is inconsequential, it replied. Magical items are the size that their creators decide at the time of creating the item itself, but are large enough to serve the purpose they are designed for. Why? How large would you need such an item to be? I took a few moments to think the question over. Make 10 of them. Turn them into rings. Rings? The architect asked curiously. Very well. However, that many will take at least a few months. I nodded and grinned. That's acceptable. Start right away. Sacrifice as many darkspawn as you need to. Just get it done. It stared at me silently for several moments. Very well. Would you like to tell me what it is you're planning? No, I laughed. Maintain this stronghold. I'm going to take some of the horde. I'll be back by the time you're finished. Make sure all of our magical weapons and armor are piled in this room. When you're finished, toss the rings in a box and put the box in the pile. I'll be bringing home a guest. The architect set to work on my orders. I gathered up half of the woken darkspawn and headed north. Luckily, a good number of the darkspawn had come from the free marches near Kirkwall. I had those darkspawn lead the way. It took us almost 2 months of dedicated marching to get to Kirkwall. When we finally arrived, I had to take a few nights to get to know the city, specifically Lowtown. However, what I was looking for wasn't there. My frustration nearly got the better of me until I realized that Merida had said that all of the origins were people like us. That meant that the mage likely had kept his family out of ruin, and my search needed to be done in Hightown. A few nights was all it took to find the Amel estate. The Woken and I left the plain darkspawn in the deep roads with commands to remain there until we called for them. We then climbed through the tunnels and into Kirkwall's sewers and out onto Kirkwall's streets. We wore simple hoods and scarves. Kirkwall was a city where people pretended not to see you at night, or at the very least avoided eye contact. So long as we didn't cause trouble, we wouldn't get anyone coming up to us to get a good enough look at what we truly were. When we arrived at the door to the estate, I knocked politely. It took a minute before an elderly man dressed as a well-to-do servant answered the door. Before he could greet us or ask us about our business at the estate, I ran my sword through his throat, and my generals rushed into the house. I had trained them who to look for. While we could use females to take back to the deep roads, I had ordered every female killed and any elderly male taken hostage. Anyone that looked too young was to be killed as well. In the span of a few minutes, all the older males were rounded up and gagged, while everyone else was dead. My generals kept the men on their knees while I looked them over closely. Everyone in this room will be dead in the next 10 seconds if someone doesn't tell me the truth. My men are going to remove your gags. If you so much as raise your voice or speak before I invite you to, I will begin flaying one of you alive at random. I will make sure that this process will take days, and I will make sure the only food you get is what we cut off of that person. If, after that person has been consumed completely, I will flay another. Only this time, it will take weeks. I squat down and glared at the group. Do we have an understanding? The fear in their eyes was exquisite. How I wished I could dine on it. They nodded, eyes full of terror. I chuckled and motioned for my generals to remove the gags. After the gags were removed, I stood and looked down at the men curiously. Which of you is Gamlen Amel? I am... A man who looked to be in his 50s with dark gray combed-back hair answered. I motioned for him to be stood up and grinned at him. Gamlen, such a pleasure to meet you. Gamlen stared at me as if I were going to eat him. What? I asked. No greeting for your guest. Your peers in the Dwarven Kingdom have much better manners than you. When I spoke with Princess Oradum, she showed me the utmost courtesy. She curtsied, introduced herself, even had polite conversation up till the point where we got down to business. Even then, she was mostly courteous. You humans, though, much to be desired. Sorry, Gamlen stammered. How may I help you? Better, I smirked, but not by much. Now, may I ask who these other men are? Gamlen swallowed hard before nodding to each man in turn. This is my father, Lord Aristide Amel, my uncle, Faustin Amel, Lords Harin and Isvolde. Do your father and cousin live here with you? I asked, as I pulled a dagger out to begin picking my nails with it. My father does, sir, he answered. My uncle just arrived from Tantervale with his family. I chuckled and grabbed a chair. You don't mind if I sit, do you? It's been a long journey. Gamlen shook his head in response. I scowled and punched him in the stomach. He doubled over, but one of the generals kept him standing up. I told you, I growled. I expect a certain level of etiquette. It took several moments of cough and gasping before Gamlen could stammer, Please, sir, do sit. Make yourself at home. I nodded as I sat down. Better. Now, Lords Harin and Isvolde. Why are they here? They came to join us for dinner to welcome my uncle to the city, Gamlen explained quickly. And do they have family here in the city? I went back to cleaning my nails with my dagger. Family that will be expecting them home this evening? Gamlen looked at the other two men. I believe they do. You believe they do? I arched my brows. Yes, they do, he said immediately when he heard the irritation in my voice. I motioned for Gamlen to be gagged before focusing on the others. Lord Harin, do you love your family? He nodded so fast, I thought his head might pop off his neck. Do you want your family to end up like the Amels? I asked. He shook his head quickly. What about you, Lord Isvol? I looked at the other man. Do you want your family to end up like the Amels? He shook his head as well. Then this is what the two of you are going to do. I sat forward and grinned. You're going to let my men escort you home. They will stay there. And I will make sure that just a few feet below your basements will be a small horde of darkspawn. You will say nothing, alert no one. You will remain in your homes along with your family. As far as the world at large is concerned, you are all sick. When my business with the Amels is finished, I swear to you, my men and I will leave. You and your families will not end up slaughtered in your homes like the Amels. My men will not bother you so long as you keep to our agreement. I let them think over the offer for some time before asking, "Do we have an agreement?" They nodded frantically, obviously desperate to keep them and their family alive. "Excellent," I said. I motioned for 2 generals to take each lord home. After the lords left, I instructed Gamlen to write a note to his family in Ferelden. The letter said that his parents were ill and that he could not take proper care of them. It asked for someone to come to Kirkwall to help manage the estate. I wasn't going to wait for whoever arrived, but I knew that Bethany, Carver, or whoever their sibling was, would probably be sent. I always hated Gamlen, but Dragon Age 2 was my favorite out of the series apart from the Darkspawn Chronicles DLC, so I was going to make sure that one of them was in Kirkwall, at least until my Darkspawn could overtake the city properly. Call it a puckish preference. We left the city 2 nights later, with all signs of the slaughter cleaned up. Strangely, all members of Lord Harin and Lord Isvold's family disappeared as well. The Kirkwall City Guard would never discover what happened to the missing families. We force-marched our hostages through the deep roads to a ruin nearly 50 miles from the city. These ruins were in the western edge of the Vimark Mountains. The ruins were an ancient Grey Warden prison where Coryphaeus was imprisoned. We brought the 2 Amels, as well as the Harins and Isvoldes, with us to the chamber where Coryphaeus was interred. As we entered the open chamber, I snatched Gamlen by the hair and dragged him up onto a circular dais. Before he could ask what was happening, I drew my dagger and opened his throat. I dropped him to the ground and watched as he clutched at his neck, trying to stem the blood. I could hear his father screaming in denial as his son's life faded away. The blood activated a magical seal which glowed gold, then burst open. Coryphaeus emerged from the dais and floated in the air, looking around at his surroundings. Be this some dream I wake from? Am I in the Dwarven lands? Why seem their roads so empty? He looked down and noticed me. You, serve you at the Temple of Dumat. Bring me hence. I must speak with the first acolyte. I stepped back and bowed. Forgive me, Great One, but this is a Grey Warden prison. We have freed you using blood from the brother of the man who most recently sealed your tomb decades ago. Indeed, he asked as he looked around, then focused on Aristide. He is also of the line that held me. I can smell it on him. I motioned for the general holding Aristide to bring him forward. He is the father of the man who most recently reaffirmed the seal on your present. We offer him to you as a gift of fealty in hopes that you will lead our armies. Coryphaeus studied me carefully before nodding. I shall accept this gift. Where have you stationed your armies? I started to answer before I could feel Coryphaeus worming his way through my mind to answer the question himself. I see it, he said. He turned and waved his arms, conjuring a large violet collection of energy which settled onto the ground in the crude shape of a large archway. Come, we shall go there now. We all stepped through the archway and were instantly transported into the main cavern of our stronghold. The Darkspawn were instantly enthralled by him and came en masse to meet their uncontested master. All of them but the architect, who was able to resist the urge because of his free will. Coryphaeus looked at me. A sizable force, but I sense a stronger force in the world. Explain this to me. Follow me, my lord. I bowed my head. I will bring you to the architect who will be able to explain better than I can. The answer didn't seem to please Coryphaeus, but he was in a new world with an army ready to serve him. That seemed to give him the patience to humor my request. Lead on. I bowed once again and led him to the architect's chamber. The architect watched Coryphaeus enter and seemed uniquely interested. Is this the guest you mentioned? Guest? Coryphaeus snarled. I am no guest. I am your new master. This one tells me you have knowledge of the great power I am sensing in the world. Explain this power to me. The architect looked at me and I nodded, signaling him to tell the Magister about Merida. He nodded and steepled his long fingers together. As you wish. I believe you are sensing the presence of Princess Merida Orodum. She is the princess of the dwarves of Orzammar. Orzammar, Corypheus scoffed. A dwarf. Do not mock my intelligence, creature. Dwarves cannot use magic. They have no ties to real power. This one does, the architect insisted humbly. She is unique. An anomaly. She has garnered a great deal of magical power and has even begun claiming a large swathe of territory within the Fade. What? Corypheus barked. She would dare step foot where only the Magisters may tread. She would dare to try and claim the realms of the gods. As you say, the architect bowed his head. You say this upstart is in Orzammar, Corypheus seethed. She is, my lord, I answered quickly. Corypheus turned and wove another portal into existence. On the other side, I could see the familiar sight of Orzammar's arena, where many dwarves were in the stands. I will show this upstart princess what true power is. When I give the command, have all of my forces come through this portal. We will slaughter the dwarves to a man for this insult. As you command, my lord, I replied, but Corypheus had already stepped through the portal. Let us prepare the dark spawn, the architect said, seemingly unfazed by Corypheus's appearance. No, I said quickly, and made my way over to the pile of weapons he'd had stacked in a corner. The rings. Are they here? Indeed, he answered calmly, just at the front, under a few of the weapons. I sorted through the pile until I found a small box. I opened it quickly and took the rings out, placing one on each of my fingers. May I ask what you are planning on doing? The architect said. I'm gambling, I replied. We watched silently as Corypheus threatened Merida. We watched as Merida imperiously defied him. We watched as 4 dwarven champions masterfully battled against the Magister. One died, then 2. A second was left unconscious. I recognized the one that remained. That one had been among Merida's companions when we'd first met. I watched in anger as he began to wield the stone the same way Merida did. Now there were 2 of them. I would have to contend with 2 Titan-blessed dwarves. Finally, though, I saw my opportunity. Corypheus was on the ground, the death blow imminent. I stepped through the portal, and the dwarf that had been battling him jumped back defensively. I looked from the dwarf and up to Merida. This was perfect. My grin was so wide it almost hurt. Now, I would put the architect's enchantments to the test. I dropped down, bit down onto Corypheus' neck, ripping out a large chunk to force him to bleed out quickly. I stumbled. I could feel a presence entering my mind. I could feel Corypheus's will trying to overcome me. The pain was tremendous. I clutched my head as I battled against his psyche to keep my mind. The agony was like shards of ice and fire leading through every nerve of my body. What seemed like an eternity must have only been a few moments, because when I looked up, the dwarf that had brought Corypheus down was readying himself to engage me. I pushed the pain aside as the magic from the enchanted rings seemed to form a shield around my soul. I stood up and grinned maniacally up at Merida before stepping back through the portal and letting it close behind me. The architect stared at me cautiously as I came back through the portal. 7? Are you all right? I smirked as Corypheus's blood dripped off my chin. You have no idea.